Hi, I'm Adam in Wales, and I've recently been talking about the different variety of board games that are available right now, as well as the different types of dice games and the different mechanisms used in dice games. So this is the final in that sort of trio of videos. This video we're going to be looking at my top 10 different types of card game mechanisms. Now this was the hardest list of the three to make. Board games are diverse, but card games really could feature anything, and in fact there's many board games that use cards. So do they feature in a list like this, or are they board games, or are they card games? What if they use dice as well? Where do they fit? So I admit this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but these are games that I consider primarily card games, and I've tried to categorise and hone the list down to just the sort of fundamental mechanisms involved. Come up with a few more than 10, but I'm going to give you my top 10 card game mechanisms today. So the first category of card games on my list is going to be push your luck card games. Now there's not a huge number of these. It's not a genre that I think gets used actually all that often, but the most significant entry into this genre is Alan Moon's Diamant, which was then re-released as Incan Gold, and I think is coming back as Diamant again fairly soon. Now this is a classic game of pulling cards from a deck. You're turning over a card, and then you decide whether you want to continue to turn over more cards, and so you push your luck, and as long as hazards don't come out of that deck, then you're okay and you're going to continue to gather treasure. Now the players are all doing this simultaneously, and so you want to be the player that stays in the longest and takes the most treasure, but by doing that you make yourself vulnerable to the most hazards, so you may be better off getting out with a small amount of treasure, because pushing your luck and staying in for the maximum amount of treasure means that you might end up going away with nothing. Of course, that's a classic sort of gaming mechanism, but it's most effectively implemented in this game, Diamant, or in Incan Gold. But a more recent game which has done something similar is this little game, Dead Man's Draw. Now in Dead Man's Draw, the different cards all have different effects. So when you turn them over, you'll be stealing cards from other players, or you'll be taking additional cards, you'll be gaining additional benefits from the cards. But if you turn over too many matching cards, then you end up with nothing. So Dead Man's Draw is a really nice, neat, small implementation again of the genre. Another good one is Port Royal, or Port Royal, which is a sort of pirate-themed game with an economy running through it as well, so you're generating money. I don't have a copy of that to show you. So these are push your luck card games. When you think of card games, you don't necessarily think of economics and economic gaming, but actually auction games are well served by the sort of card game mechanisms and card handling and card play. That idea of I lay out some cards and then we auction off who gets to take those cards. It's a manner of drafting, really, a manner of working out who gets which cards. It's very effectively done in Reiner Knizia's game Modern Art, which is a bit of a classic, which has various different types of auctions and they all work differently. Now that's quite a heavy game, but there is a simpler game which does auctions very well, and that's For Sale. For Sale has two different types of auctions. It plays very quickly for 3 to 6 players, plays well at all those different player counts, and really is very sort of adaptable for all different gaming groups. It's an excellent game. A game that's slightly less well known is Friesematenten. Now, Friesematenten has Friedemann Friese's sort of traditional, his trademark humour and that sort of art style. It's quite sort of frivolous and silly in its theming, and it's by no means a masterpiece, but it feels a bit like a precursor to Power Grid in its economics. We have factories that are producing and we're getting income from them, which we then use to purchase other cards which are going to benefit us in some way. It's quite a nasty sort of edge to it. We can attack other players. Only available in Germany and in German, so my copy, I've had to paste it up with English translations, which was a lot of work. But I'm glad that I did it, because it is, although an oddity and only something that I would play quite rarely, it is a bit of a treat. card play lends itself quite naturally to the idea of I play a card to attack another player. And so there's a whole genre of what we call take that card games, or I think of them as combative sort of card games. These date right back, this is back from 1990 and was a game I played a lot as a child when I was still interested in wrestling, which I'm not at all now, but this is still one of my favourite games, Wrasslin. It's totally silly, extremely random, but essentially we're playing cards to attack other players. Friedman Fries had Landlord. Landlord is a game where we're playing cards and building up buildings, where each card is a floor on a building. On the back of the cards we have those sort of building structures, but on the front of the cards we have the tenants that we place into the buildings. As well as tenants, though, you could place bombs or murderers into these buildings, or the police can then take away a murderer, or you know, there's all manner of different card play you can do to attack other players' houses and interact with them. This is the older version of Landlord. There's a newer, sort of fancier, more colourful version that came out fairly recently. Then we have little oddities like Beastie Bar from Zoc. This is a game where we have a bunch of animals trying to get into a nightclub, and when I play an animal, they'll push their way through that queue to get in, or they might get kicked out depending on the different actions of the different animals. Crazy, silly sort of theme. Again, a fairly frivolous sort of gameplay and nasty in terms of its card play, but quite quick and fun. Then we have Flash Duel, which is a Serlin game, very similar to Rainer Knizia's On Guard. This is a game that has a lot of card play in it in terms of calculating numbers and things like this. A very simple, basic central mechanism, but what Flash Duel has is many characters with special powers, and the card play is all about a battle of sort of advancing, attacking, retreating, and trying to just get that attack in at just the right moment. Very quick games, and it's fun and loads of variety in that box. I didn't really know what to call this next genre of games, so I'm going to call them Follow the Number. Essentially, we're talking about games which have a number, perhaps a colour as well, maybe a little bit more information, but basically we're playing patterns of numbers, trying to follow a sequence or trying to match numbers. I suppose your most famous example is Uno. In terms of more modern games that have a little bit more decision making than something like Uno, a very popular one is No Thanks. You couldn't go far wrong with No Thanks. Another really popular one would be Six Nimmt. So Six Nimmt has been played a lot over recent years. But there are other lesser known versions that are equally as good. So 23 is a very good game about playing a number, following different number sequences. Same with Dicht Dran. Okay, so this game is by NSV, who makes some lovely games along these lines. Habe Fertig is another one by NSV. But Amigo is a good publisher to look at if you're interested in this sort of game. They're great fillers, generally take 20-30 minutes, can be fitted into a gaming evening at the beginning, at the end, or while you're waiting for other players to join. So I think it's well worth players having, you know, a couple of these games in their bag whenever they go off to gaming things, and certainly having games like this in their collection for filling those little gaps in between bigger games, or perhaps for train journeys and things like that. So I'm calling this category Follow the Number. A few years ago, it was the case that Seven Wonders was the sort of figurehead for the card drafting games. Now, of course, when we talk about card drafting, what we really mean is any form of selection where we have a series of cards and we choose them. But it's come to mean this pass and play mechanism, where in Seven Wonders you would have a hand of cards, you would select one of those cards and then pass the rest on to your neighbour. This was also utilised in a game called Fairy Tale, perhaps even slightly earlier than in Seven Wonders. But now, the figurehead for the genre is probably Sushi Go. Sushi Go has been an enormous hit. This is the original edition. There's been two more editions since then. There's the American sort of game right version in the little tin, and then a lovely Zoc version with some really crazy sort of artwork, which is very pretty as well. Other games which have been successful in this genre recently, Medieval Academy has been a bit of a success. There was a Donald X. Vaccarino game called Greed that was quite good. Divinare perhaps is a slightly less well-known drafting game. In this game, it's a deduction game. So as those cards are passed round, obviously you're gaining information about which cards are in the deck. In this game, players then go on to make predictions about how many of each card are in the deck and how and their predictions, the effectiveness of those predictions, the accuracy is what generates you points. And another great example of a drafting game that came out last year was Sheep and Thief. So Sheep and Thief combines card drafting with sort of tile laying mechanisms, joining up roads and rivers and placing sheep around, a bit like a sort of Carcassonne style gameplay, but the tiles are cards which are drafted to you in the same manner as in games like Sushi Go. This list would certainly not be complete without a mention of deck building games. So deck building was created really by the game Dominion. Now this is a heavy box because I've got a number of expansions in here and it's absolutely rammed full of cards. What we're talking about with deck building is essentially each player will start with a hand of cards, a small number, and they will shuffle those cards up, deal some out to themselves. So they've got their own individual deck. They'll then use the cards that they've dealt themselves to purchase other cards. So the amount of money that they've dealt out to themselves will allow them to buy other cards, which they then add into their deck. The discard pile keeps getting shuffled in, so the deck gets bigger and bigger throughout the game, and the cards that they buy will give them all sorts of special abilities, ultimately allowing them to spend quite a lot of money in a single turn to buy some really good cards that are going to win them the game. So Dominion was the first of these games, but it was quickly followed by games that tried to put a bit more theme into it, sometimes successfully, sometimes less so. One of the first was Thunderstone. This is a later version of Thunderstone Numenera, but this put a fantasy theme onto it. So instead of just buying cards that loosely represented property, here we're fighting monsters and we're using those cards to build weapons and little armies basically that we send out to fight these monsters in this dungeon. It works fairly well. It makes the game a lot longer and clogs it up a lot. There's something delightful about the simplicity of a game like Dominion, which you can teach to people really easily and play very, very quickly. And then people start doing all sorts of weird and wonderful things with deck building. Friedman Fries came out with his game CopyCat, which tried to combine deck building with Agricola and a little bit of Through the Ages put in there, a little bit of Puerto Rico. Really an oddity, but a neat use of the deck building mechanism. And then there's this game Paperback. So Paperback is a word building game, sort of like Scrabble, but with deck building. So the cards are your letters, and you deal out a certain number of letters. You then spell a word, and the quality of that word gives you the income that allows you to buy better letters to put into your deck. So your deck gets better, more and more letters in it, more useful letters, different special abilities. So Paperback is a neat sort of variant on that genre, but there have been all manner of deck building games over the last few years. A little bit of a craze about deck building, slowing down slightly now maybe, but it's a major genre in its own right, all sparked off by that one game Dominion. Many of the games on this list feature a form of set collection, whereby we're taking cards and we're putting them together like colours and numbers go together, matching colours and numbers, and that features in many of these games, certainly in games like Sushi Go and Seven Wonders and other games that we've already mentioned. But some games make a feature of the simplicity of that, and that's the next genre of games that I'm going to be showing you. So we're talking about games like Lost Cities, Rainer Knizia's classic, for 2 players. Jaipur, also a good 2-player game about set collection, beautiful cards. A lot of these games actually tend to be very good for 2 players, set collection games. That's certainly true of games like Yardmaster. Yardmaster is an interesting case because it had this very stark sort of graphic that was lovely and effective, but it was replaced by a newer edition in some countries, which is called Aramini Circus. So you can see here that the artwork in Yardmaster is very stark, really nice, neat graphic design. It's very effective. But if we look at Aramini Circus, we've got a very childlike sort of art style, which is probably more in suiting to the simplicity of the game. In addition to those games, we've also got games like Biblios. This is a there's slightly more to this one, but again, it's basically set collection, and we set the values of the different sets by changing values on certain dice. It's got this lovely sort of box, which is in the shape of a book, a particularly nice sort of feature because the theme is all about having a sort of library in the Middle Ages. Kodama, the tree spirits. In this game, we're laying out cards to build a tree. And when we place branches onto this tree, the symbols on those branches, if they match the symbols going down the branch and onto the trunk, we're going to gain more points. So it's a form of set collection again. Hamsterbacke is a slightly lesser known game, a German game from Amigo. Amigo make a ton of these small box card games, a lot of them about set collection, and this is a particularly cute example with some lovely sort of artwork, based around sort of hamsters and the different things that they're eating. But essentially, it's another set collection game. Tableau building is a significant feature in many card games. In fact, it would be included in games like Seven Wonders, which we've mentioned previously. And often it has a pacing that's similar to deck building games. Your classic tableau builder would be something like San Juan. In San Juan, you're using cards to buy other cards. But in this game, unlike in a deck builder, you're actually discarding the cards that you use to purchase things. But then the cards that you buy get laid out in front of you and they give you special abilities. This is where it starts to pace like a deck builder, because throughout the game, your cards get better and your abilities get better, and suddenly you're building an engine and you're generating more on your turn. This is seen extremely effectively in the game St. Petersburg. This is the original edition of St. Petersburg with this very unusual art style. This is a fantastic card game. It has got a board in it, but the board is kind of irrelevant. What we're doing is buying cards, laying them out in front of us, and they're going to keep generating us money or points throughout the game. And in each turn, we're going to get better and better because of those abilities that are in front of us. There is a newer version of St. Petersburg, which is this version, which has got perhaps more generic style of artwork. This has got added expansions and different options in it, which work very well, although I do like the charm of the original. And then we have more modern game, Abyss. Now this looks like it should be some sort of American thematic fantasy fighting game. It's not at all. It's a simple game of card play, auctions, but eventually building up cards in front of you with different abilities that mean that your turns just get better and better throughout the game. Same with a game like Machi Koro. This one's very simple, very light, and very similar to a deck builder in its feel, this one, because you've always got a series of decks of cards available on the table and you can choose which ones you buy. And then you add them to your tableau and they're going to generate you income throughout the game. So Machi Koro is another good example of a tableau building card game. Now we really are onto one of my favourite genres, so that is speed games. Now these usually have a deck of cards. You turn over a card and then you have to do something very quickly, either deduce some sort of puzzle, work out what you're supposed to say, work out what you're supposed to grab, and do it quicker than all the other players. I love these games. Anybody can play these games. Not everybody can play them well. With practice you get better at them, but that doesn't mean that those skills are going to transfer to other games in the same genre. So we're talking about games like Ghost Blitz, probably the best in the genre really. Ghost Blitz is a fantastic game. Similar game, same designer actually, Schicki Micki, again from Zock zum Spielen. But there's games like Pick a Dog, Tarantula Tango, all manner of these different games that you have that speed element to them. Generally the games tend to be cheap, portable, play them with all different ages, all different sizes of groups of players, so they're extremely versatile, and again great fillers to put in between bigger games. So I love speed games. I think it's a fantastic category of card games and often overlooked. Now this really is one of my favourite genres of games. So we're talking about trick-taking games now, and the closely related genre, climbing games. Now trick-taking games, very, very straightforward in their basic format. I'll show you how that works. I'm going to use a stick elm deck in order to show you how a trick-taking game works. Now, this doesn't particularly relate to stick elm itself, but this is how the basis of all trick-taking games. So essentially, each player will have a hand of cards with numbers in different suits. So different colours, and the player will choose to play one of them. So for example, he might choose to play the 7 of purple. The next player then looks at their own hand of cards, and they also must play purple. They've got to follow suit, and they want to beat a 7. So this player might, for example, choose to play a 10. So that the second player is now winning. The third player then looks at their hand of cards. Now, they don't have any purples, so they can't follow suit, and normally they would have to. But because they don't have any, they could play any colour. However, they're going to lose as a result, because you have to play the highest number in the lead suit. So this player might choose to throw away his 1 of green, for example, which means that the player who played the 10 wins the trick. They take the cards to market and they put it in a pile alongside them. That player then takes the next turn. So the player who won that suit then has a look at their hand, and they might choose to play, for example, the 2 of blue. So they put the 2 of blue down. The player who's next in line says, right, he's going to try and beat it with a 3 of blue. And then we come round to the final player who looks at their hand. Now, they don't have any blues, so they're going to have to play something else. Now, in most trick-taking games, in each round there will be a trump colour. So let's say, for example, that in this round grey was the trump colour. That means that although this player can't play any blue, he can now play a grey, because he can play any colour he likes, and grey is the trump. So by playing his 13 of grey, now he wins the trick, even though he hasn't played the highest in the lead suit, and he would take these cards. Trick-taking games are, by their very nature, random, because you have a handful of cards that are dealt out to you, and they may be good cards, they may be bad cards. And the way that a lot of games deal with this is by allowing you to make predictions. So you make predictions about how many tricks you're going to win, or how many tricks another player's going to win, or perhaps predicting that you're not going to win any at all. So often there's an element of reading your hand and making predictions, and then the accuracy of your predictions is what scores you points. I actually have my first published game is coming out later this year, and that is a trick-taking game called Ruffling Feathers, and which works around this idea of predictions, reading your hands, reading the other players' hands, and making judgments based on that. So that'll be coming out at Essen in 2016 by Brain Games. It's surprising to think that that basic mechanism can be turned into all these different games, and they all tweak it slightly in different ways. So we have games like Mal Pflaumen, which has become a little bit more like an auction set collection thing, still with an element of trick-taking in it. Pala allows you to take different colour cards and combine them to make new colours. So you might put blue and red together to make purple and things like that. So we can mix up the suits as if they were colours on a paint palette. Potato Man just changes the fact that you don't follow suit. In fact, you're not allowed to follow suit. So they all make slightly different changes. Some of them even... for example, Stichmeister has all manner of different trick-taking games within the same box. So this one, every round, the rules will be different. Something similar happens in Nyet to a slightly lesser extent. We have On the Cards. On the Cards, again, different rule sets for every different sort of round of the game. In Chronicle, we have different player powers on the different cards. So different cards have different abilities. All manner of different things happen in trick-taking games. So there we have my top 10 card game mechanisms. You'll notice that I've missed out some fairly significant genres in here, largely because they don't suit my tastes. I suppose most specifically, I haven't talked about collectible card games like Magic the Gathering or Yu-Gi-Oh! I know they're extremely popular. I've never really got into that whole collectible scene. And likewise, I haven't really got into the living card games, the ones where you have to you buy a box of cards, which is your starting pack, and then they regularly release expansions like every month or every couple of months, and you have to keep up with those in order to stay competitive, albeit they don't have the randomness of the sort of booster packs you get in those collectible card games. I've never really got into any of that collectible stuff, and I think you get a similar feel by playing games like deck building games and stuff like that. I'm not pretending it's the same thing at all, but for me it's enough of a sort of toe in those waters to keep me satisfied without churning out a load of money and also those games tend to involve a lifestyle of playing the same game over and over and over again in order to stay competitive, and then there's tournament play and those sort of things. So I haven't touched on those games, but hopefully I've given you a broad picture of the world of card games aside from those things. Of course, we haven't mentioned every type. I've just spotted on the side here, I've got a little dexterity game that's a card game, Super Rhino, you know, where we're stacking cards up. You can do all sorts of weird things with cards. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and all the best.